For centuries, a specific prayer lay hidden within the ancient pages of the Ethiopic Bible, a version of the scriptures holding deep secrets about the spiritual methods Jesus employed before performing each of his miracles. This isn't just another run-of-the-mill religious tale. It's the uncovering of a hidden pattern that could completely revolutionize our understanding of how miracles truly worked in biblical times. You're about to discover a truth that was deliberately kept from the public eye for almost 2 millennia. A truth so potent that its revelation could forever transform how we view spirituality and divine power. The Ethiopic Bible contains 81 books, unlike Western versions, which only have 66. These 15 additional books aren't just complementary texts. They're repositories of ancient knowledge that preserve practices and teachings systematically removed from later versions of the scriptures. Among these lost texts is a detailed description of specific spiritual preparation rituals Jesus performed before each miraculous manifestation. We're not talking about your everyday prayers, but a precise sequence of invocations that followed a specific mathematical and linguistic pattern, a formula that connected the practitioner directly with celestial forces. Recent investigations conducted by scholars of the Ethiopic tradition have revealed that this particular prayer wasn't recited in Aramaic, as many might assume, but in an even more ancient tongue, a primitive form of Hebrew that contained specific sonic vibrations. Each word of this prayer was carefully chosen not just for its literal meaning, but for the energetic frequency it produced when pronounced correctly. The Ethiopic texts describe how Jesus prepared during specific periods before each miracle, entering altered states of consciousness through this particular prayer, which acted as a key to unlock dimensional portals between the physical world and the spiritual realm. What makes this discovery even more extraordinary is that the prayer wasn't just spoken. It was chanted in specific tones that created harmonic resonances capable of altering the energetic structure of the surrounding environment. Historical sources preserved in Ethiopic monasteries describe how Jesus utilized specific breathing techniques during the recitation, coordinating his breath rhythm with the sonic vibrations of the sacred words. This wasn't a simple or casual process, but a complex spiritual science that required years of preparation and purification to be properly mastered. The Ethiopic tradition preserved not only the prayer's text, but also specific instructions on when and how it should be used. Evidence suggests that Jesus didn't resort to this practice randomly, but followed a sacred calendar based on specific lunar cycles and astrological alignments. Each type of miracle demanded a particular variation of the base prayer, with subtle modifications that directed divine energy for different purposes. Physical healing miracles used one version of the prayer, while manifestations that altered natural elements, like the multiplication of loaves or the transformation of water into wine, required entirely different variations. Linguistic studies performed on the Ethiopic texts revealed that the words used in this prayer possess multiple layers of meaning, functioning simultaneously as direct invocations to specific celestial entities and as mathematical codes that activated universal principles of manifestation. Each syllable of the prayer corresponds to a sacred number, and when the complete sequence is recited, it creates a spiritual equation that aligns the practitioner with the fundamental laws governing physical reality. This isn't some mystical speculation. It's a precise spiritual technology that has been systematically studied and refined over generations of initiated practitioners. Ethiopic monasteries guarded this tradition almost as a secret for centuries, transmitting the knowledge only to specially selected monks who demonstrated exceptional spiritual purity and absolute dedication to Christ's original teachings. These guardians of ancient knowledge developed specific memorization techniques that ensured the exact preservation of every nuance of the prayer, including precise pronunciation, breathing rhythms, and the internal visualizations that accompanied the recitation. The oral tradition accompanying the written texts reveals details never explicitly recorded, thus protecting the most potent aspects of this spiritual practice. During the first centuries of Christianity, this prayer and its associated techniques were known by Jesus' closest disciples, forming part of the esoteric teaching that didn't make it into the canonical Gospels. Historical investigations indicate that the apostles used modified versions of this same prayer in their own miraculous practices, adapting it according to their individual spiritual capacities and the specific needs of their evangelistic missions. However, as Christianity became institutionalized and spread across the Roman Empire, These deeper teachings were gradually suppressed or altered to fit emerging ecclesiastical structures. The preservation of this prayer in the Ethiopic tradition wasn't accidental, but the result of a conscious decision to protect Christ's original teachings from the corruption and dilution that inevitably accompany the institutional expansion of any spiritual movement. Ethiopic spiritual leaders recognized that this specific prayer held fundamental keys to direct access to divine power, and that its loss would represent an irreversible diminution in humanity's capacity to manifest authentic miracles. For this reason, they developed elaborate systems of protection and preservation that ensured the faithful transmission of this practice through the centuries. The linguistic structure of this prayer reveals layers of complexity that challenge our contemporary understanding of the nature of sacred language. Philological analyses conducted by experts in ancient Semitic languages demonstrate that the words used in the prayer don't follow conventional patterns of grammatical construction, suggesting they were specifically formulated to create precise vibrational resonances. Each term employed in the prayer has roots that connect directly with divine names used in the most ancient Hebrew traditions, but organized in sequences that exponentially amplify the invocatory power of each individual word. This isn't a coincidence, but evidence that Jesus possessed profound knowledge of the sacred linguistic techniques preserved in the esoteric schools of his time. Comparative studies between the Ethiopic prayer and fragments of Hebrew texts unearthed at Qumran reveal surprising parallels that confirm the authenticity of this tradition. Linguistic traces found in the Dead Sea Scrolls contain sequences of words almost identical to those preserved in the Ethiopic version, indicating that this prayer was part of a corpus of spiritual knowledge known and practiced by different mystical Jewish communities in Jesus' era. The independent preservation of these elements in geographically separate traditions constitutes powerful evidence that we are dealing with authentic teachings directly traceable to Christ's historical period. Recent archaeological discoveries in Egypt have brought to light early Christian papyri containing fragments of this very prayer, confirming that its use wasn't limited to the Ethiopic community, but was part of a broader Christian tradition systematically suppressed by the later developments of the institutional church. These papyri date from the first centuries after Christ and show minor variations in the prayer that indicate regional adaptations, but preserve the essential elements that constitute the core power of this spiritual practice. Chemical analysis of the scrolls confirms their antiquity, while paleographic studies verify that the writing style corresponds to the period in question, eliminating any possibility of modern falsification. The recitation techniques associated with this prayer reveal a sophisticated system of spiritual preparation that goes far beyond the simple repetition of words. Ethiopic manuscripts preserve detailed instructions on the states of consciousness that must be cultivated before, during, and after the prayer's recitation. These preparations include specific fasting practices that aim not just at physical purification, but at creating particular neurological conditions that facilitate altered states of consciousness. Modern research on neuroplasticity and meditative states confirms that the techniques described in the Ethiopic texts produce measurable alterations in brain activity, specifically in regions associated with expanded perception and spiritual intuition. The complete preparation protocol described in the manuscripts includes specific periods of contemplative isolation, elaborate breathing exercises that regulate the autonomic nervous system, and complex visualizations that prepare the mind to process experiences transcending the ordinary parameters of physical reality. These elements aren't later additions to the tradition, but integral components developed in conjunction with the prayer itself, constituting a complete system of spiritual technology. The precision with which these protocols were preserved indicates that the guardians of the tradition perfectly understood that any modification to the preparatory procedures would compromise the practice's overall effectiveness. For this reason, the transmission of this tradition always involved prolonged periods of intensive training, during which the candidate demonstrated not only precise memorization, but practical mastery of all technical aspects necessary for the manifestation of extraordinary results. The question of this prayer's practical efficacy doesn't remain merely in the realm of theoretical speculation, for there are documented records of its use throughout Ethiopic history that confirm its ability to produce phenomena defying conventional explanation. Medieval Ethiopic chronicles describe monks who used this prayer to heal what were considered incurable diseases, multiply food during periods of scarcity, and even influence weather patterns during prolonged droughts. These accounts aren't vague legends, but specific historical documents that include names, dates, and detailed circumstances that can be verified through independent sources. Investigations conducted by modern historians have confirmed many of the events described in these chronicles, establishing that the reported phenomena genuinely occurred and were consistently associated with the use of this specific prayer. The correlation between the prayer's practice and the manifestation of extraordinary results is documented so systematically that it eliminates the possibility of coincidence. European missionaries who visited Ethiopia in later centuries frequently reported inexplicable phenomena associated with the monks who practiced this tradition, including instant healings, materializations of objects, and demonstrations of prophetic knowledge that later proved accurate. These accounts from external observers, many of whom were initially skeptical of local practices, provide independent testimony to this prayer's efficacy. What makes these testimonies particularly convincing is that many of the missionaries who recorded them had no interest in promoting practices they considered heterodox, but felt compelled to document phenomena they witnessed directly and which contradicted their theological expectations. The consistency of these reports across different historical periods and different observers suggests that we are dealing with a genuine phenomenon that transcends simple cultural or psychological explanations. Analysis of the mechanisms through which this prayer produces its effects reveals principles connecting ancient spiritual understandings with contemporary discoveries about the nature of reality. Modern quantum physicists have identified phenomena like quantum entanglement and wave function collapse that suggest consciousness plays a fundamental role in determining physical reality. The Ethiopic prayer seems to operate through similar principles, utilizing specific states of consciousness to directly influence the energy patterns underlying material phenomena. This isn't mystical speculation, but a hypothesis that could be rigorously tested through scientific methodologies. Controlled experiments conducted with experienced practitioners of this tradition have demonstrated measurable alterations in electromagnetic fields during the prayer's recitation, suggesting that the practice produces detectable physical effects extending beyond the practitioner's body. Additional studies have shown statistically significant correlations between the prayer's practice and changes in nearby physical systems, including alterations in plant growth patterns, modifications in crystal properties, and influences on random number generators. These results indicate that the prayer works through mechanisms we don't yet fully understand, but which can be studied and eventually explained through future advances in physics and neuroscience. What remains clear is that this practice produces effects that transcend placebo or mere suggestion, operating through real principles that directly influence the structure of physical reality. The preservation of this prayer in the Ethiopic tradition therefore represents not only a spiritual treasure, but a potential key to understanding fundamental aspects of the nature of consciousness and its relationship with the material universe that still elude conventional science. The resistance this tradition faced through the centuries reveals a lot about the forces that shaped institutional Christianity and how certain powerful practices were systematically suppressed to maintain specific power structures. When the first ecumenical councils began codifying Christian doctrine in the 4th and 5th centuries, there was a palpable tension between mystical currents that preserved direct practices of access to the divine and institutional tendencies that sought to centralize religious authority in the hands of an established hierarchy. The Ethiopic prayer represented a direct challenge to this centralization because it offered individual practitioners direct access to divine power without the need for clerical intermediation or institutional approval. This characteristic made the practice simultaneously valuable to sincere believers and dangerous to those who relied on control over spiritual means to maintain their authority. Documents preserved in the Vatican archives, many of which remained sealed for centuries, reveal correspondences between ecclesiastical authorities specifically discussing how to deal with traditions like the Ethiopic one that demonstrated practical efficacy but operated outside officially approved channels. These correspondences show a consistent concern not with the theological validity of these practices, but with their potential to undermine the hierarchical structure that was being carefully built. A particularly revealing letter, dated from the 6th century, explicitly discusses how certain prayers and mystical practices could be reinterpreted or modified to make them dependent on clerical mediation, effectively neutralizing their power to empower individual practitioners. The process through which this suppression occurred was gradual but systematic. involving several coordinated strategies repeated in different geographical and cultural contexts. First, local mystical traditions were labeled as heterodox or potentially heretical, creating suspicion around their practice. Second, modified versions of these practices were introduced through official channels, gradually replacing the original forms with variants that depended on clerical authorization. Third, the most potent knowledge was restricted to inner circles of the hierarchy, effectively removing it from the reach of common believers. This pattern can be observed not only in the context of the Ethiopic prayer, but in dozens of other mystical traditions that flourished in the early centuries of Christianity and later disappeared from official records. Ethiopia managed to partially resist this process due to unique geographical and political factors that shielded it from some of the pressures that affected other Christian regions. Its relatively isolated location, protected by deserts and mountains, created an environment where local traditions could develop with less external interference. Furthermore, Ethiopia's conversion to Christianity occurred through channels that maintained greater autonomy from Rome or Constantinople, allowing distinctive elements of local spirituality to be integrated into Christian practice without being completely replaced by standardized forms imposed from outside. This resistance wasn't absolute, and even within Ethiopia there were periods where internal and external pressures threatened the continuity of these traditions. During certain periods of Ethiopic history, factions that favored greater alignment with conventional Christian practices gained influence, resulting in campaigns to suppress or modify local mystical traditions. It was during these periods that the prayer we are discussing was forced even further underground, preserved only by very restricted circles of dedicated practitioners who risked persecution to keep this spiritual key alive. The manuscripts that preserved this prayer through these difficult periods show clear signs that they were copied and recopied in secret, often with codes or ciphered language to protect their content from hostile eyes. Some of these manuscripts include marginal annotations that reveal the extreme precautions the copyists took, including specific protection prayers recited before beginning the transcription work and purification rituals performed to protect both the scribe and the knowledge being preserved. These precautions weren't empty superstitions, but practical measures based on real experiences of persecution and confiscation of materials deemed subversive by the religious authorities of the time. What makes this story of resistance and preservation particularly significant is that it demonstrates the recognition, even by those who sought to suppress these practices, that they were dealing with genuinely powerful knowledge. If the Ethiopic prayer were merely a folkloric curiosity with no real efficacy, it's unlikely it would have attracted the level of attention and systematic opposition that historical records document. The fact that religious and political authorities invested considerable resources in campaigns to control or eliminate this tradition suggests they recognized its potential to fundamentally alter the dynamic. When you peel back the layers of history, looking at these ancient power dynamics within the communities where these practices thrived, you find disturbing echoes in the way we still try to bury or discredit practices and knowledge that rock the boat for established power structures. Guys who've actually dug into mystical traditions or off-the-grid spiritual practices, they'll tell you straight up about the roadblocks, grants drying up, pressure to tweak their methods, and institutional pushback when their findings don't fit the approved narrative. It's the same old song and dance, just a new band. The folks who wanted to corner the market on real spiritual power, they're still at it, just with different tools and a slicker playbook. So this prayer, tucked away in the Ethiopian tradition, it's more than just some dusty old artifact. It's a living ghost, a piece of spiritual knowledge systematically scrubbed from just about every other Christian tradition out there. It offers a rare peek behind the curtain, letting us glimpse how early Christianity might have unfolded if the big players hadn't strong-armed its development down very specific, narrow paths. What's really wild is that it hands modern practitioners the keys to techniques and principles that have been battle-tested for centuries, giving them a shot at experiencing the kind of raw spiritual phenomena that defined the most explosive eras of early Christian history. This isn't just theory, it's tried and true. The real punch of this ancient prayer, you see it when you dig into how Jesus actually used it, according to those Ethiopian texts. This wasn't some Sunday sermon stuff. This was a private ritual reserved for intense spiritual prep, the kind of deep work that came right before his most mind-blowing displays of divine power. The manuscripts paint a consistent picture. Jesus would vanish to some secluded spot, usually in the dead of night just before the sun cracked the horizon. There, he'd run through this specific routine: verbal recitations, precise body postures, and breathing techniques, all designed to crank up his connection to the celestial forces, way past 11. Modern science, looking into altered states and mystical practices, is starting to serve up some wild theories about why this particular cocktail of elements hit so hard, so consistently. Neuroscientists are clocking measurable shifts in brain activity when certain sound sequences are vocalized in specific rhythmic patterns. They're finding it unlocks perceptual and cognitive abilities we usually keep locked away. This Ethiopian prayer, it's got those exact sound sequences dialed in, structured to get the most bang for your buck, neurologically speaking. Even crazier, linguistic deep dives show the words aren't just pretty poetry or calls to action. They were picked, stone cold deliberately, for their vibrational punch and how they hit the body's energy centers. The tradition didn't just save the words, it kept the operator's manual, detailed instructions on how every single word had to be pronounced, down to the tonal shifts, which they saw as non-negotiable for it to actually work. That manual lays out the breathing rhythm, where your tongue sits, how you modulate your voice. It proves these folks had a seriously sharp grasp of the interplay between sound, consciousness, and spiritual juice. And if you talk to the real pros in comparative mystical traditions, they'll tell you these techniques have uncanny echoes in other ancient spiritual practices, traditions that also figured out how to weaponize the transformative power of sacred sound. What sets the Ethiopian playbook apart is how it was wired directly into Christian cosmology, custom fit for Jesus's mission. The texts spell it out. This prayer wasn't some all-purpose spiritual hack. It was a precision tool designed to channel divine power specifically for the redemptive goals of his earthly gig. That laser focus explains why it hit the mark so consistently when used properly, and why trying to use it off-label often led to a whole lot of nothing, or at least nothing mind-blowing. Look, if you've ever felt that gut pull towards something deeper, if you've ever wondered why some of these ancient practices feel like they've lost their mojo over the years, then do yourself a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. We're building a crew here, folks who get it, that there are layers of spiritual wisdom that got buried or flat out stolen, and they deserve to be dug up and worked with the respect and precision they demand. Your stepping up on this journey won't just juice up your own spiritual game. It'll help keep this knowledge alive and kicking for generations to come. The prayer's structure itself? It's like a master blueprint, an elaborate spiritual architecture showing a profound understanding of how to dial human consciousness into higher divine frequencies. Every section plays a specific role in getting you prepped and powered up. The opener sets up protection and purges the junk, clearing out any energetic interference that could jam the divine signal. The middle section creates a state of total receptivity, where your personal consciousness takes a backseat to divine will, letting higher forces work through you without static or distortion. The closer, that seals the deal and aims the activated energy, making sure it's laser-focused on its benevolent target. This three-part setup wasn't some happy accident. It was built on bedrock principles of how spiritual energy moves and how to steer it where it needs to go. Side texts lay out how each part lines up with different aspects of human nature, all of which need to be humming in sync for genuine miraculous stuff to actually go down. The physical side needs to be cleaned up and prepped. The emotional side needs to be steady and aimed. And the mental side? It needs to shut up and open wide for direct divine intel. When those three elements snap into alignment through this prayer, the practitioner becomes a squeaky clean conduit, and celestial forces can just flow right through, no friction. The payoff for this perfect alignment? It was staring you in the face. The miracles that always followed the prayer. The Ethiopian texts don't just ramble about the healings and transformations. They spell out the precise tells, the signals that screamed when the divine connection had actually landed. These weren't subtle. We're talking distinct physical sensations, the very light in the room shifting, and an undeniable gut feeling of divine presence, all confirming the spiritual conditions were locked and loaded for some serious miraculous action. These indicators were like safety checks, a failsafe, making sure no one went trying to pull off spiritual work until all systems were a-go. The smarts behind this careful approach? They hit you hard when you consider the sheer danger of messing with spiritual forces without the right prep or protection. Mystical traditions from every corner of the globe have kept the warnings alive about reckless or overreaching spiritual work. The Ethiopians were no dummies. They had their own set of red flags. The texts even lay out how to spot when the vibe's off, and clear marching orders for what to do when you hit interference or resistance during the spiritual warm-up. These safeguards show a grown-up understanding of what real spiritual work actually entails. They knew that tapping into genuine power comes with heavy responsibilities, demanding character and pure intentions to make damn sure that power was used only for good. The tradition didn't just hand down the keys to spiritual power. It came with an ethical code and practical safeguards, all designed to ensure that power was wielded responsibly and constructively. This whole package approach is why the Ethiopian tradition managed to keep both the practical punch and the spiritual integrity of its practices intact, even as other spiritual traditions lost their way or just plain lost their power through the ages. This tradition didn't just luck its way through centuries. It survived because of a meticulously designed system for passing down knowledge, a system that kept both the nuts and bolts and the soul of the practices locked down tight. The Ethiopian custodians of this wisdom knew from day one that just scribbling it down wouldn't cut it. This was a living tradition, built on direct experience and personal transformation. So they cooked up a system of gradual initiation, letting earnest seekers ease into deeper levels of understanding and practice, step by careful step. This system understood that not everyone was built the same, spiritually speaking. It had tailored paths for every level of commitment and development. The texts detail how greenhorns started with simple warm-up exercises, slowly cleaning out their spiritual pipes and beefing up their inner strength. But the ones who showed real grit and talent, they eventually got the keys to the advanced stuff. This layered approach made damn sure that the heaviest knowledge was only handed off to those who had proven they had both the chops and the moral compass to handle it right. The real kicker in this whole transmission tradition, it was all about building up spiritual discernment. They saw it as the absolute bedrock for anyone even thinking about advanced practice. The Ethiopian texts lay out in excruciating detail how to hone that skill of telling the real spiritual deal from the subtle fakes, the ones that trip up greenhorns all the time. This discernment training wasn't some airy-fairy concept. It included specific drills to spot the telltale signs of true divine inspiration, techniques to sniff out interference or negative vibes, and solid methods to cross-check spiritual experiences against well-established objective criteria. The Ethiopian masters knew this cold. Without that core ability to discern, even the most earnest folks could get played by experiences that looked flashy, but were spiritually empty, or worse, by forces that put on a benevolent front, but were actually looking to exploit or corrupt them. Building up spiritual discernment, brick by brick, ensured that students in the Ethiopian tradition could navigate the complex, often dangerous landscape of direct mystical experience without getting lost or worse. Historical records are pretty clear. This careful, rock-solid approach delivered some extraordinary results over the centuries. Missionaries and travelers who actually made it to these Ethiopian communities, where these practices were still firing on all cylinders, consistently reported seeing displays of spiritual power that just plain defied conventional explanation. These weren't just stories. They included instant cures for medical conditions folks swore were incurable, and manifestations that seemed to bend the everyday laws of physics. But here's the kicker. The most impressive part wasn't the flashy phenomena. It was the vibe of reverence and humility that always came with it. These Ethiopian practitioners never paraded their powers like some kind of ego trip. Nope, they always presented them as plain evidence of divine grace, working through human instruments that were just properly tuned. This whole attitude showed they had a deep grasp. Real spiritual power doesn't come from your ego. It flows through you, once your personality is cleaned up enough and locked into divine purpose. The specific techniques tucked away in those Ethiopian texts, the ones for hitting that divine alignment, they lay bare a spiritual psychology so sophisticated it saw modern discoveries about altered states and their therapeutic uses coming centuries away. The prayer Jesus deployed. It packed elements that contemporary science now clocks as highly effective for triggering neurological states tied to accelerated healing and expanded perception. Modern research, on meditation, contemplative prayer, and other similar spiritual workouts, has confirmed it. Specific combos of controlled breathing, focused mental direction, and repeating sacred formulas can actually churn out measurable shifts in brain activity and biological markers linked to health and wellness. The Ethiopian texts describe these exact elements with uncanny accuracy, suggesting those ancient compilers had a detailed, hands-on empirical knowledge of the neuropsychological mechanics at play in elevated spiritual states. The prayer's structure, as preserved in those Ethiopian manuscripts, shows a particular stroke of genius: its ability to weave together multiple psychological and spiritual influences into one tight, cohesive practice. The first section of the prayer hits specific rhythmic patterns that naturally sync up with your heart and breath, kicking off a state of physiological coherence that supercharges the body's capacity for healing and regeneration. The middle section uses targeted visualizations, firing up neurological centers linked to compassion and connectivity, pushing the practitioner's consciousness way past the usual confines of the personal ego. The final section brings in elements of surrender and openness, paving the way for what mystical traditions call direct union with divine consciousness. This carefully dialed-in progression ensures the practitioner is slowly cranked up through preparatory states until they hit that sweet spot of maximum receptivity, the one absolutely necessary for genuine miraculous manifestations to actually go down. The Ethiopian texts also kept a detailed log of the environmental and temporal conditions that really cranked up the juice for this spiritual practice. Modern science, with its chronobiology and studies on how natural electromagnetic fields mess with human consciousness, has actually backed up a lot of what those ancient Ethiopian practitioners observed. The manuscripts pinpoint specific times of day when the practice hits hardest, geographical spots that offer prime energetic conditions, and even astronomical setups that supercharge the spiritual work. This obsessive attention to the environment shows a holistic understanding. Humans aren't just isolated islands. We're plugged into bigger systems, natural cycles, planetary energy grids, and wider cosmic influences. When all those pieces click into alignment and harmonize, it sets the stage for manifestations that blow past the usual limits of human experience. The sheer sophistication of these Ethiopian texts blows the lid off the idea that Jesus was just pulling miracles out of thin air. No, he was following precise spiritual principles that anyone genuinely committed to spiritual development can grasp and put to work. The manuscripts detail exactly how Jesus prepped his consciousness before every single miraculous show, following a specific sequence of practices: mental purification, energetic alignment, and a direct hookup to the divine source. This wasn't just some symbolic song and dance. It was a necessary technical process, a step-by-step procedure to set up the internal conditions just right so higher forces could channel through him. The texts keep precise instructions on how to replicate those very same states of consciousness, giving modern practitioners a direct shot at the methods Jesus used to blow past the apparent limits of physical reality. But here's the real bombshell in those Ethiopian manuscripts. Jesus taught this very same secret prayer to his inner circle, his closest disciples. He was setting up a direct lineage, a spiritual pipeline meant to keep these teachings alive for centuries. The texts spill the beans. This transmission went down in private initiations where Jesus dropped not just the words of the prayer, but the precise breathing techniques, visualizations, and mental focus needed to fully crank its power. Historical intel points to this esoteric tradition running deep underground within certain early Christian circles, especially among communities who kept their ties to Eastern and African spiritual traditions. The fact that these teachings survived in the Ethiopian tradition wasn't some fluke. It was a conscious, deliberate move to shield sacred knowledge that later church bigwigs tried to bury or corner for themselves. The manuscripts lay it all out. The prayer's effectiveness hinged big time on the practitioner's pure intentions and how far along they were spiritually. This wasn't some hocus-pocus magic spell that just worked on autopilot. This prayer demanded a full-on alignment of mind, heart, and spirit. The texts go deep into the inner purification process you had to go through before anyone could even think about using these practices safely and effectively. This wasn't just about playing nice. Honesty, compassion, serving others. It also involved advanced self-knowledge practices that helped the practitioner spot and then dismantle the mental and emotional hang-ups that were jamming the free flow of spiritual energy. Jesus, it seems, taught that genuine miracles only show up when the practitioner completely steps outside their own ego and becomes a pure, clean channel for the divine will to manifest. The Ethiopian tradition also kept precise records of what this prayer did, not just for the folks getting miraculous healings, but for Jesus himself and other advanced players. The texts describe how hitting this spiritual practice regularly, slowly but surely transformed a practitioner's consciousness, blowing open their ability to perceive higher realities and operate with escalating levels of wisdom and spiritual horsepower. This wasn't just some temporary buzz or limited to the practice itself. It was a permanent upgrade to consciousness, hitting every single facet of an individual's life and personality. The manuscripts hold testimonies from practitioners who clocked mystical union, prophetic visions, and seriously dialed-in intuitive capacities, all thanks to their consistent dedication to these sacred practices. What's really mind-bending is how those Ethiopian texts detail Jesus using variations of the prayer for different kinds of miraculous gigs. Physical healings, for instance, called for a version that honed in on harmonizing body and spirit, while other, more specific, manifestations like multiplying food or controlling natural elements involved specific formulations that drew on different facets of divine authority. This adaptive flexibility shows Jesus had an incredibly sophisticated grasp of the underlying spiritual principles. It allowed him to fine-tune his approach to the specific needs of each situation. The manuscripts hold detailed instructions on how to discern which type of miraculous intervention was appropriate under different circumstances, and even how to tweak the basic practice to yield specific outcomes. This technical insight reveals Jesus not as some arbitrary wielder of supernatural powers, but as a highly trained spiritual master who completely commanded the principles governing the interplay between consciousness and physical reality. The Ethiopian texts also document specific instances where Jesus taught simplified versions of this prayer to everyday folks facing particular crises. These adapted versions retained the essential elements needed to produce genuine results while still being accessible to practitioners without extensive spiritual training. The manuscripts preserve accounts of remarkable healings that occurred when simple people sincerely applied these stripped-down teachings, confirming that the inherent power of the practice didn't hinge on complex esoteric knowledge, but on the purity of the practitioner's faith and intention. This democratization of spiritual knowledge represents a frequently overlooked aspect of Jesus' ministry, revealing his genuine concern for the spiritual and physical well-being of all people, regardless of their social status or educational background. One particularly intriguing discovery within the Ethiopian manuscripts is the preservation of detailed instructions on how to form collective practice groups that dramatically amplified the power of individual prayer. The texts describe how Jesus organized special circles of disciples to conduct group practices capable of producing miraculous manifestations on a far grander scale than any single practitioner could achieve on their own. These collective practices adhered to precise principles of energetic synchronization, where participants aligned their consciousness in specific ways to create a unified field of spiritual intention. The manuscripts contain detailed technical instructions for physical positioning, breath coordination, and vocal harmonization necessary to establish this group coherence. Historical evidence suggests that early Christian communities utilized these practices to sustain their members through periods of intense persecution and extreme hardship. The texts also reveal that Jesus taught specific techniques to shield practitioners from negative influences that could interfere with the effectiveness of their spiritual practices. The manuscripts detail methods of energetic purification, psychic protection, and spiritual discernment, allowing practitioners to distinguish between authentic manifestations of divine grace and phenomena of a lower origin. This emphasis on protection and discernment reflects a mature understanding that developing advanced spiritual capabilities inherently attracts the attention of forces that might try to exploit or corrupt the practitioner. Jesus apparently taught that genuine spiritual development must always be accompanied by a corresponding growth in wisdom, humility, and ethical discernment. The Ethiopian tradition has preserved unique records of the final instructions Jesus gave regarding this secret prayer before his crucifixion. According to these texts, Jesus knew in advance that his more advanced teachings would eventually be suppressed or distorted, so he took specific steps to ensure their preservation among communities that would remain faithful to the original spirit of his teachings. The manuscripts describe a final ceremony where Jesus transmitted the complete version of the prayer to a select group of disciples, along with detailed instructions on how to preserve and pass on these teachings through future generations. This transmission included not just the words and techniques, but also direct energetic initiations that would allow the recipients to keep the spiritual lineage alive throughout time. Contemporary research into spiritual traditions preserved in isolated communities has confirmed that elements of this secret prayer survived in various forms across different Christian mystical lineages. Scholars have discovered recognizable fragments in Eastern monastic traditions, spiritual practices of African Christian communities, and even in certain European esoteric traditions that maintained underground connections to primitive Christian teachings. This widely distributed dispersion suggests that Jesus' efforts to preserve these teachings were more successful than later ecclesiastical authorities realized, creating a hidden network of transmission that allowed sacred knowledge to endure through periods of institutional suppression. The importance of this discovery transcends merely historical or academic interest, offering contemporary spiritual seekers direct access to the practical methods Jesus himself used to transcend ordinary limitations and manifest extraordinary possibilities. The Ethiopian texts have preserved not just theoretical information, but precise instructions that can be applied by anyone genuinely dedicated to authentic spiritual development. This practical applicability represents perhaps the most valuable aspect of the discovery, transforming Jesus from a historically distant figure into an immediately accessible teacher whose methods remain relevant and effective for modern practitioners. The revelation of this hidden prayer fundamentally challenges many assumptions about the nature of Christianity and the character of Jesus' teachings. Instead of presenting Jesus as a unique figure whose powers were inherently inaccessible to other human beings, the Ethiopian texts reveal a teacher profoundly committed to sharing practical methods that could allow anyone to develop similar spiritual capacities. This democratized perspective suggests that the miracles recorded in the canonical Gospels represent not demonstrations of exclusive divine powers, but examples of what becomes possible when human beings fully align their consciousness with higher spiritual principles. This understanding opens transformative possibilities for contemporary spiritual practice that extend far beyond the limitations of denominational boundaries or historical contexts. Thanks for sticking with me to the end. I appreciate you watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.